October 25th, 1944. The Battle of Cape Engaño. Rear Admiral Chiaki Matsuda stands on the bridge of Hyuga, commanding a warship that seems to defy logic. Above him rises the towering, heavily armored pagoda mast of a First World War dreadnought, surrounded by 8 14-inch guns. But behind him, stretching across the stern, is the flat, 70-meter aviation deck of an aircraft carrier. The sky above the Philippine Sea is black with American dive bombers. Hyuga and her sister ship Ise are maneuvering violently through the largest naval battle in history. They were rebuilt as aviation battleships, a radical compromise intended to combine the firepower of a capital ship with the reach of carrier aircraft. Yet as American bombs tear open the sea around them, their flight decks are completely bare. There are no dive bombers waiting on the catapults. There are no reconnaissance aircraft being raised from the hangars. The ships have entered their defining battle without a single operational aircraft aboard. Why did the Imperial Japanese Navy spend precious wartime resources cutting apart 2 massive dreadnoughts, only to send them into combat as empty, heavily armored decoys? To understand how these bizarre ships became the most radical hybrids of the Second World War, we have to rewind to before they had flight decks, to a time when they were aging battleships being left behind by a war that had outgrown them. For decades, Japanese naval strategy had been built around the idea of a decisive battle. American forces would advance across the Pacific. Japanese submarines, destroyers, and carrier aircraft would weaken them along the way. Then, somewhere in the Western Pacific, the surviving enemy fleet would be met by Japan's battleships and destroyed in a final surface engagement. By 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy had already demonstrated that aircraft carriers could serve as powerful offensive weapons. The attack on Pearl Harbor had made that unmistakably clear. But the battleship still occupied a central place in the Navy's broader vision of war. Carrier aircraft might shape the battlefield, but many officers still expected the final decision to come from heavy guns. Ise and Hyuga were physical embodiments of that older doctrine. Laid down during the First World War, the 2 sister ships displaced more than 35,000 tons at full load and carried 12 14-inch guns in 6 twin turrets. Their hulls were protected by heavy armor. Their towering superstructures were built to direct long-range artillery fire. They had been designed to survive punishment and destroy enemy battleships in return. But they possessed a serious weakness in a carrier-dominated war: speed. Modern Japanese fleet carriers could exceed 30 knots. Even after extensive modernization, Ise and Hyuga could manage only about 25. That was respectable for an older battleship, but not enough to operate efficiently with Japan's fastest carrier striking forces. The hybrid's aging machinery could not simply be transformed into the propulsion system of a modern fleet carrier. During the opening months of the Pacific War, the 2 dreadnoughts were not entirely inactive. They took part in supporting operations and remained available for the decisive surface battle Japanese planners still expected. But they were no longer at the center of events. While carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, swept through Southeast Asia, and reached deep into the Indian Ocean, Ise and Hyuga remained secondary instruments, powerful ships waiting for a kind of battle that refused to appear. Then the strategic balance collapsed. In the first week of June 1942, catastrophic news reached Tokyo from the Central Pacific. At the Battle of Midway, American dive bombers struck the Japanese carrier force at its most vulnerable moment. In a single day, 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were lost. They were not merely 4 ships. They represented the core of Japan's offensive naval aviation. Their flight decks, aircraft, maintenance crews, and experienced pilots could not be replaced quickly. Japan had entered the war with a formidable carrier force, but it lacked the industrial depth to rebuild that force at the same speed as the United States. The Naval General Staff urgently searched for replacement flight decks. Building a new fleet carrier from the keel up required years of labor, enormous quantities of steel, specialized machinery, and dockyard capacity. Japan no longer had enough of any of them. The Navy therefore began examining ships already in service. Could passenger liners be converted? Could submarine tenders become light carriers? Could older capital ships be transformed into aviation vessels? Among the candidates were Ise and Hyuga, and in Hyuga's case, an accident had already begun the demolition. 1 month before the disaster at Midway, Hyuga had been conducting a gunnery exercise in the Seto Inland Sea. Her main battery consisted of 6 twin 14-inch turrets. 2 were positioned forward, 2 amidships, and 2 aft. Each turret was not simply a gunhouse placed on the deck. It sat above a massive armored structure extending deep into the hull, surrounded by ammunition hoists, loading machinery, magazines, and hydraulic equipment. On May 5, 1942, something went catastrophically wrong inside turret number 5. A premature detonation occurred in the left gun breech. The blast ignited nearby propellant charges and blew the heavy roof off the turret. 51 men were killed. Only the rapid flooding of the magazines below prevented the fire from reaching more propellant and threatening the entire ship. Hyuga survived, but the turret was destroyed. When the ship returned to Kure, workers removed the ruined gunhouse, sealed the damaged position, and installed temporary anti-aircraft weapons over the opening. A few weeks later, Midway transformed that damage from a liability into an opportunity. Japanese planners considered converting older battleships into carriers. The fast Kongo-class ships were still valuable because they could operate with the carrier fleet. The modern Nagato class remained central to the traditional battle line. The slower Fuso-class battleships were also considered, but Ise and Hyuga offered several advantages. They were slightly newer and faster than the Fusos. Hyuga had already lost one of her aft turrets, and converting a pair of sister ships would simplicity training, maintenance, and tactical employment. The accident did not single-handedly determine the decision, but it made Hyuga, and by extension Ise, a logical place to begin. The Navy now had its hulls. The next problem was deciding what to build on them. A complete conversion into conventional aircraft carriers was examined. In theory, the battleships could be stripped of their guns and rebuilt with full-length flight decks capable of carrying substantial air groups. In practice, the idea demanded more than Japan could afford. The shipyards would have to dismantle 6 massive turrets from each vessel, remove armored structures extending deep into the hull, cut away much of the superstructure, construct enclosed hangars, install aircraft elevators, reroute ventilation and exhaust systems, add aviation fuel storage, and rebuild the ship's internal arrangements almost from the waterline upward. Even after all that work, the result would still be limited by the original hulls. Ise and Hyuga were slower than true fleet carriers. Their machinery occupied space never intended for aviation operations. Their armored battleship hulls carried weight that a purpose-built carrier would never have accepted. A complete conversion would consume valuable dockyard capacity for too long. So the Naval Technical Department, commonly known as CAMPON, developed a compromise. The ships would not become full aircraft carriers, they would become half carriers. The forward sections would remain largely intact. The pagoda masts, armored conning positions, and 4 forward twin turrets would be retained. The 2 aft turrets would be removed, along with the structures surrounding them. Over the cleared stern, engineers would construct an aviation deck supported by a framework of steel. Beneath it would be a compact hangar, aircraft handling spaces, an elevator, rails, and storage facilities. The ships would preserve 8 14-inch guns, enough at least on paper to remain dangerous surface combatants. At the same time, they would gain the ability to launch aircraft beyond the horizon. It was not an elegant new doctrine. It was an industrial compromise created by urgency. The reconstruction began in late 1942 and continued through 1943. At Kure and Sasebo, dockyard cranes descended on the sterns of the 2 battleships. Workers dismantled the remaining aft turrets, cut through armored structures, removed barbettes and ammunition handling machinery, and rebuilt the spaces below. The scale of the work was enormous. Each turret assembly represented hundreds of tons of steel. Its supporting structure extended through multiple decks. Removing it required far more than lifting a gunhouse from the hull. Workers had to strip out the machinery that had once carried shells and propellant from the magazines to the guns. When the demolition was complete, the ships possessed a vast opening where their aft firepower had once stood. Over it rose the new aviation facilities. The resulting deck was approximately 70 meters long, far too short to function like the flight deck of a conventional carrier. Aircraft could not safely land on it. A returning dive bomber required a long, clear approach, arresting wires, and enough space to absorb its speed. The stern of an Ise-class battleship offered none of those things. The aviation deck would therefore be used primarily for launching and handling aircraft, not for landing them. 2 large catapults were installed near its forward edge. Aircraft would be moved from the hangar by elevator, placed on wheeled trolleys, guided along deck rails, and launched over the side. The planned air group consisted of 2 different types. The first was the Yokosuka D4Y Suisei, a fast, land-based dive bomber known to the Allies as the Judy. The second was the Aichi E-16A Zwin, a reconnaissance seaplane known as the Paul. Together, the ships were intended to handle as many as 22 aircraft, distributed between the small hangar, the deck, and the catapults. But the 2 aircraft types created very different recovery problems. The D4Y had conventional landing gear. Once launched from Ise or Hyuga, it could not return to the ship. Its pilot would have to land on a conventional carrier or fly to a friendly airfield. The E-16A was a float plane. It could land on the sea beside the battleship and be lifted back aboard by crane. The ships were therefore not entirely incapable of recovering aircraft, but they could not operate a self-contained air group in the way a true carrier could. A conventional aircraft carrier could launch a strike, recover it, refuel and rearm the planes, then send them out again. It could sustain repeated operations over several days, provided its deck and machinery remained functional. The aviation battleships could not do that efficiently. Their dive bombers depended on outside landing facilities. Their seaplanes required calm enough water to land beside the ship and the time-consuming use of cranes to return aboard. Their small hangars and exposed deck arrangements limited maintenance and handling. The aviation facilities gave Ise and Hyuga reach, but not independence, and the reconstruction created another engineering challenge. Removing 2 aft turrets and the heavy structures beneath them significantly changed the ship's displacement, trim, and rolling characteristics. The weight of the original weapons had been built into the design of the hull. Once that mass disappeared, the ships no longer behaved exactly as their designers had intended. Campon's engineers needed to restore weight to the stern and bring the ship's stability closer to an acceptable operating condition. Their solution was crude but effective. A layer of concrete, approximately 8 inches thick, was laid across the aviation deck. The concrete acted partly as ballast, helping compensate for the weight removed with the turrets. It also provided a degree of protection for the aviation spaces below, although it was not equivalent to purpose-built naval armor. It was an extraordinary sight. A battleship that had surrendered 2 of its main turrets was now carrying a concrete-covered aircraft deck to preserve its balance. By late 1943, both ships had emerged from reconstruction. Their silhouettes were unlike anything else in the Japanese fleet. Forward, they still looked like dreadnoughts, tall pagoda masts, armored bridges, and 8 14-inch guns. Aft, they resembled compressed aircraft carriers, with flat decks, catapults, rails, an elevator, and a small hangar suspended over the hull. They were neither battleships nor carriers. They were hybrids created by necessity. But a flight deck is only dangerous if it has aircraft, and an aircraft is only useful if it has a trained crew. By the middle of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy had organized the 634th Naval Air Group for service with Ise and Hyuga. Rear Admiral Chiaki Matsuda commanded the 2 ships as Carrier Division 4. Training began for the unusual combination of catapult-launched dive bombers and reconnaissance seaplanes. On paper, The aviation battleship concept was finally approaching operational form. In reality, time had already run out. Japan's greatest shortage was no longer flight decks, it was trained aviators. Years of combat had destroyed much of the elite aircrew that had entered the war in 1941. Fuel shortages restricted training. Replacement pilots received fewer flying hours. Maintenance standards declined. Aircraft production could not compensate for the loss of experienced crews. The newly organized air group assigned to Ise and Hyuga was not yet fully prepared for shipboard operations. Then, the strategic situation in the Philippines deteriorated. In October 1944, American forces moved toward the Philippine island of Leyte. Japan activated Operation Shogo, a desperate plan to throw much of its surviving fleet against the invasion. Every available aircraft was needed. The planes intended for the hybrid battleships were transferred to land bases, including positions on Formosa. There, committed to conventional land-based operations, the unit suffered severe losses under relentless American carrier attacks. The aviation battleships had finally received their air group. Then the air group disappeared before the ships could use it. Days later, Ise and Hyuga were ordered to sea. The Japanese plan for the Battle of Leyte Gulf divided the fleet into several forces. The main surface formation, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, would approach the invasion area from the west. Other forces would move through the southern passages. To the north, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the surviving Japanese carriers. But Ozawa's force had very few aircraft. Its primary purpose was not to destroy the American fleet. It was to be seen. The Japanese hoped the carriers would lure Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from the landing area, clearing the path for Kurita's battleships and cruisers to attack the vulnerable invasion force. Ise and Hyuga joined Ozawa's northern force. They had been designed to combine guns and aircraft. Now they carried only the guns. Their aviation decks were empty. In strategic terms, they had become what Japan needed most at that moment: convincing targets. On October 25, 1944, the bait was taken. American reconnaissance aircraft located Ozawa's force off Cape Engaño. Believing he had found Japan's remaining carrier threat, Halsey sent powerful groups of fleet carriers north. Hundreds of American aircraft rose from their decks. The northern force could offer little fighter protection. Its flight decks were mostly empty. Its carriers were vulnerable, slow to respond, and exposed beneath a sky controlled by the enemy. Wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo planes descended. Zuikaku, the last surviving fleet carrier that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, was struck repeatedly. Light carriers nearby were engulfed by bombs, torpedoes, and fire. Ise and Hyuga entered the same storm. Their conversions had left them with unusually heavy anti-aircraft armament. By late 1944, each ship carried more than 100 barrels of 25mm anti-aircraft weapons, along with dual-purpose guns and banks of unguided anti-aircraft rockets. Their surviving 14-inch guns could also fire Sanshiki shells. These specialized rounds burst in the air and scattered incendiary tubes and fragments in front of attacking aircraft. They were spectacular, but their practical effectiveness was limited. They produced vast flashes, smoke, and debris without offering the precision of a true proximity-fused anti-aircraft weapon. Still, the hybrids fired everything they had. Their heavy guns thundered, dual-purpose mounts sent shells upward, 25mm weapons filled the air with tracer fire. Rockets erupted from their launchers in violent, inaccurate salvos. At the same time, the ships maneuvered aggressively. Matsuda repeatedly ordered changes in speed and course as American aircraft entered their attack runs. Bombs struck the sea around the ships, throwing towering walls of water over their decks. Near misses tore holes in external plating and drove fragments into exposed positions. Hyuga escaped without serious direct damage. Ise was less fortunate. A small bomb struck near the catapult area, causing casualties, while near misses damaged both vessels. But neither ship was crippled. Around them, The actual Japanese carriers were being destroyed. Zuikaku sank. Zuiho sank. Chitose and Chiyoda were lost. The Northern force paid an enormous price for drawing the American carriers north, yet Ise and Hyuga survived. Their concrete aviation decks did not transform them into invulnerable ships. Their anti-aircraft fire did not sweep the American planes from the sky. Their survival came from a combination of heavy construction, determined damage control, aggressive maneuvering, and fortune. But the contrast was impossible to ignore. The ships built to launch aircraft survived the battle with empty decks. The carriers they were meant to supplement sank around them. Their survival did not make the aviation battleship concept a success. They had entered the engagement without aircraft. They had launched no strike. Their flight decks contributed nothing to the battle. They survived as battleships. And they survived while performing the role of decoys. After Cape Engaño, Ise and Hyuga returned to Japan. But their war was not yet finished. In early 1945, the two ships took part in Operation Kita, one of the final major Japanese naval movements from Southeast Asia. Loaded with valuable strategic materials, including fuel and raw resources desperately needed by the collapsing Japanese war economy, they sailed from Singapore toward Japan. American submarines hunted the force along the route, but the ships reached home in February 1945. It was one of the few remaining missions for which their unusual design still offered value. Their empty hangars and aviation spaces could carry cargo. Their heavy armor gave them protection. Their anti-aircraft batteries made them formidable escorts. The hybrids had failed to operate as aviation warships, but they remained useful hulls. That usefulness could not last. By the summer of 1945, Japan's naval power had effectively collapsed. Fuel supplies were nearly exhausted. Trained air crews were scarce. Most surviving major warships could no longer conduct meaningful operations. Ise and Hyuga were immobilized near Kure. Without enough fuel for sustained movement, they became floating anti-aircraft batteries, defending the approaches to the naval arsenal. Their machinery still functioned. Their guns could still fire, but their ability to maneuver, the quality that had helped save them at Cape Engaño, was gone. On July 24, 1945, American carrier aircraft from Task Force 38 attacked Kure. 4 days later, they returned. This time, Ise and Hyuga could not turn away from the falling bombs. They could not increase speed, disrupt an attacker's aim, or disappear beneath smoke while changing course. They could only remain at anchor and fire upward. American aircraft struck both ships repeatedly. Bombs tore through decks and superstructures, near misses ruptured hull plating below the waterline, compartments flooded, fires spread through damaged sections. Hyuga settled into the shallow water. Ise followed, resting heavily on the harbor floor. The ships did not vanish beneath the open ocean. They sank where they had been built, surrounded by the dockyards and mountains of Japan's inland sea. Their strange silhouettes remained visible above the water, pagoda masts rising over shattered concrete flight decks. What had the aviation battleship actually achieved? Its intended aviation role had achieved almost nothing. Neither Ise nor Hyuga launched its assigned air group in combat. The dive bombers that were supposed to extend their reach were transferred elsewhere. The seaplanes that could have been recovered by crane never turned the ships into self-contained strike carriers. The flight decks never fulfilled the purpose for which they had been built. But the ships themselves did not become entirely useless. They served as escorts, transports, anti-aircraft platforms, and decoys. They survived Cape Engaño when several true carriers did not. They completed a final transport mission through submarine-infested waters. Those accomplishments belonged to their durable hulls, their crews, and the battleship qualities they had retained. They did not vindicate the hybrid concept. The contradiction remained fundamental. A battleship was designed to carry armor, absorb punishment, and bring heavy guns within range of the enemy. An aircraft carrier was designed around speed, deck space, aircraft handling, and the ability to remain far beyond the reach of surface artillery. Combining the two did not produce a vessel with the full strength of both. It produced a ship forced to divide its weight, space, crew, and machinery between incompatible purposes. Ise and Hyuga lost 1/3 of their main battery to gain aviation facilities that could not independently recover and sustain their intended strike aircraft. They were too slow and too limited to replace fleet carriers. They were less heavily armed than they had been as battleships, and by the time their conversion was complete, Japan lacked the pilots and aircraft needed to make the idea work at all. The aviation battleship was not a technological revolution. It was a physical record of strategic desperation. Japan had lost 4 carriers at Midway and needed flight decks faster than its shipyards could build them. So it reshaped the weapons it already possessed, hoping that a compromise in steel could compensate for a collapse in time, fuel, aircraft, and trained men. It could not. The final fate of Ise and Hyuga mirrored the empire that rebuilt them. They began their lives as proud dreadnoughts, designed for a decisive artillery battle in the Pacific. They ended as concrete-laden hybrids, immobilized in shallow water, their towering pagoda masts keeping watch over empty flight decks that had never launched a wartime strike. After the surrender, both wrecks were razed and dismantled. The ships disappeared. But their story remained, a warning written in armor, concrete, and steel. When a navy tries to force 2 incompatible weapons into a single hull, the result may look revolutionary. But sometimes it is only desperation given a shape.